Good morning. He is risen. Amen. I hope that you all have enjoyed this last week, the first week of Easter. Today is the second Sunday of Easter, and I'm so glad to see everyone here in person and anyone who's joining us online. Welcome to Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church. If you don't know me, I'm Reverend Deniece Mason. I'm the pastor here. It is a glorious day, so let us all now prepare our hearts and our minds so that we might worship the risen one. Amen. So today our scripture reading is taken from the Gospel of St. John. It is the passage right after the Easter passage we read last week. It's John chapter 20, verses 19 through 31. Hear now these words. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw that it was the Lord. Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands and put my finger in the mark of the nails and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came again and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This is God's word for God's people today. Thanks be to God. Would you pray with me? Come, Holy Spirit. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So, when my daughter Meredith was about 4 years old, she was outside playing with some friends, and I was keeping an ear on them and an eye on them through the open screen door, and I suddenly heard her curse quite loudly. And let me say it was a doozy of a curse, too. It was the whole shebang. I mean, God's name and everything in one little thing. I was so shocked that for a moment I stood there thinking, well, I must have misheard her. She couldn't have said what I thought she said, but no, I did hear her correctly because she said it again. And this time even louder. Well, with that, I got to tell you, I was tripping over my feet as I flew out that door, and I tried to get to her as fast as I can. I said, "Meredith, what in the world? That is a bad word. You're never supposed to say that word." And she looked up at me with this glint in her eye and she said, "Why?" And I stuttered and I said, but because it's very disrespectful to God. Now at this point, my little cherub, who, by the way, had been in church and Sunday school since she had been 2 weeks old, looked up at me and said, "So? Who's God anyway?" she said. Now, I was about to take off into the stratosphere with this one. "You know who God is, Meredith." I said, "God is our creator. God created you and me and everything in this universe. God is, well, God." And I finished with this shout, and she looked thoughtful for a moment, and then she looked me straight in the eye and said, "Nah." Nah. Now, I'm happy to report that she's still alive. And in a weird way, a weird twist of irony, this little doubting Thomas, well, now she serves as the director for children's and family ministries at another United Methodist church. She may have been a doubter, but thank God she didn't get the nickname. Unlike the real Thomas, the skeptical disciple from our text today, the one who will forever be the patron saint of the dubious, a symbol of the prove it or it didn't happen group. The one whose first name has now become a double name, Doubting Thomas. Now, I'll tell you, of all the disciples, I find Thomas the most intriguing. We're not told a whole lot about him personally, in fact, very little. What we do know is that he, like a lot of the other disciples, had a nickname. James and John were known as the sons of thunder. Peter was called the Rock. And before Thomas was stuck with the moniker Doubter, or Doubting, his nickname was Deniece, a word that means twin. However, in the Gospels, his twin is never mentioned. Actually, throughout the whole New Testament, his twin is never mentioned. We don't know anything else about him. But his nickname was Twin. Now, unlike James, Peter, and John, Thomas only appears in 3 stories in the Bible. In the Gospels. And the first happens when Mary and Martha ask Jesus to come quickly after their brother Lazarus has died. And the disciples don't want him to go. They try to talk him out of it. They say it's too dangerous. The Pharisees are out to get you. You can't possibly go. But we're told that Thomas speaks up and he says, let's go with him so we can die with him. He's kind of all in person sometimes. Now, the second time we hear of Thomas is at the Last Supper, when Jesus tells them that he's going to prepare a place for them in his Father's house. And Jesus says, if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you unto myself, so that where I am going, you may be also, and you know the way to the place I'm going. Now, everybody is silent because it's a solemn moment, and Jesus obviously expects them to know what he's talking about. You know the place I'm going. You know the way to the place I'm going. And I can imagine them all sort of sitting around trying to act like they really do know how to get to where Jesus is going, while glancing at each other out of the corner of their eyes. Everyone, look like you understand. Pretend like you know what's going on. Just nod and smile. And everyone does it, except for Thomas. Thomas just blurts out, we don't even know where you're going. How can we know the way? Gotta love Thomas. The final story is the one we read today. And as a background, well, the text is the continuation of the text we read last week at Easter. And if you remember, that ended with Mary Magdalene mistaking Jesus for the gardener until he speaks her name. And he tells her to go tell the disciples, and she runs to announce to them that she's seen the Lord. So we begin today with the disciples all gathered in a house. They've locked all the doors, we are told, because they're afraid of the Jews. They're afraid of getting killed. They're terrified they're going to be next. Because they're Jesus' disciples, they think, well, they're coming for us. We're going to die. So here they are, they're all locked in this house. Well, all but Thomas. For some reason, Thomas is missing, and we don't know why. But Jesus comes and stands among them and says to them, peace be with you. Now imagine this for a moment. Here are all these men hiding in a locked house, scared to death that they're about to be killed, and suddenly the one that they saw killed appears in the middle of the room and looks at them and says, peace be with you. Well, actually, he didn't say peace be with you. He said shalom be with you. Shalom, peace, harmony, wholeness, completeness, well-being, and tranquility be with you. And after he sees this or says this, he shows them his hands and his side. He's giving them proof that he is who he says he is. And, well, now the disciples are ecstatic. It's Jesus. He's here. He really has risen. So they're jumping up and down with joy, probably shouting out a million questions like, how? Why? What happened? But Jesus just merely looks at them again and says, shalom be with you. Now that had to be a little strange, wouldn't it? No explanations, no sit down and let me tell you everything. Just shalom be with you. Again, he says it. As the Father has sent me, so now I send you. Jesus says it, and he breathes on them, gives them the Holy Spirit. And that's it. He leaves. If it all seems strange and somewhat incomprehensible to us, well, just imagine how the disciples felt. What? Shalom be with us? God sent me, so now I'm sending you? Receive the Holy Spirit? Wait, what? What do you mean, Jesus? But as they sit trying to absorb this whole thing, Thomas finally makes an appearance. Now, in my mind's eye, I can see all the other disciples running to him and jumping up and down and saying, where were you? You should have been here, because you'll never guess what happened to us. This is probably the biggest thing in history, my friend, and you missed it. Guess what? We have seen the Lord. And they wait, looking at Thomas expectantly. Now, there are a lot of different ways that Thomas could have reacted here. He could have looked disappointed, sad that he had missed seeing Jesus. He could have been upset and said a few choice words, wondering why he had chosen that day to go get a haircut or whatever. Or he could have even broke down and cried, so upset that everyone else experienced this wonderful thing and he hadn't been there. But Thomas chooses none of those things. Instead, Thomas looks at the disciples and says, nah, you're dreaming, guys. This didn't really happen. There's no way. Get real. You probably saw someone trying to imitate him, or maybe you had some really bad falafel and started hallucinating. But listen, my friends, I don't know how to tell you any other way, but he's dead. And dead people stay dead. So unless I see the mark on his hands and put my finger in it and put a hand in his side, well, there's no way I'm going to believe all that. And with that statement, the fate of Thomas is forever sealed. That disciple Thomas has now become the infamous doubting Thomas. Now, the text goes on to say that in another week, a week passes, and once again, the disciples are all gathered in this house. But this time, Thomas is with them. We're told that the doors are closed, and Jesus shows up in the middle of them. And he says the same thing, shalom be with you. Now he turns to Thomas, who's probably standing with his mouth hanging open at this point, and says, put your finger right here, Thomas. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Don't doubt. Believe. Now, there's no mention of Thomas actually touching Jesus. Doesn't say anything about him putting his fingers in the hands or putting his hand in his side. It just says that he sees Jesus and proclaims, my Lord and my God. Thomas, the doubter, finally believes. You know, if you'd only believed from the beginning, Jesus had to make a second trip for him and all that. I mean, sure, he believes now, but who wouldn't? I mean, Thomas was wrong to doubt. That's what we're told, isn't it? I mean, in the face of what he'd been told by the disciples, well, Thomas's reaction and his doubt proved that he was a weak link. He was one of puny faith, unlike the other disciples. This is a story we often hear, this cautionary tale. Don't be a doubting Thomas. Be a blessed one who believes without seeing. But if you think about it, don't you think it's a little odd that Thomas is the one that's called out as a doubter? I mean, Mary Magdalene told the other disciples, that she had seen the Lord, but they brushed her off. They didn't believe until Jesus appeared among them and showed them his hands and his side. Why is Thomas called out for doubting and they're not? He doesn't believe what he's told until he sees it either. See, the fact is that Thomas is really no different than the others. They all doubted. They all doubted until they actually saw. So rather than looking at this text as a condemnation of Thomas or the other disciples that doubted the reality of the resurrection, I believe that this text was written to let the rest of us know that the disciples were human beings, just like us. See, we might not like to admit it, but the reality is doubt is normal. We all doubt. God gave us this great brain, this great capacity for rational thinking. And the fact is that the resurrection is beyond rational thinking, isn't it? The concept of a loving God who sent God's Son into the world to show us how much we are loved. The concept of a God suffering for us. The entire concept of the ascension, the coming of the Holy Spirit. Well, that's all beyond rational thinking, isn't it? And we're rational people. We were made that way by the God we come here today to worship. To say that we have no doubts about the things that we profess to believe would mean that we never think deeply about any of those things. Yet many of us are afraid to admit our doubts. See, we see doubt as the enemy of faith. So we bury it. We're ashamed of it. We may be afraid that if we really confront our doubts, well, we may lose our faith. We may realize that it's all just smoke and mirrors. If we really examine our doubts, well, we may lose God. That thing we cling to so tightly will be lost to us and we'll never recover. But the truth is, doubt is the very basis of faith. See, the disciples believed in the man Jesus, and that belief was shaken to the core when he was crucified. They felt abandoned, they felt hopeless, and they're holed up together because they're afraid for 1 week until Jesus appears to them. And then they tell Thomas, and of course Thomas doesn't believe, but you see, rational Thomas, the one who refused to believe, that Thomas is also the Thomas that came back. That Thomas came back into the house, even though he doubted. He came to gather with the other disciples. Why? What was the purpose? If he didn't believe Jesus had been raised, why did he come back? Thomas went back to gather with his friends because he was brave enough to confront his doubt. In truth, he was the only one who was brave enough to express his doubt. Just as he was the only one brave enough to admit to Jesus that he was totally confused by what Jesus was saying at the Last Supper. Thomas was brave enough to voice what everyone else had secretly been thinking and feeling. He voiced his doubt. And he came back then to explore it. He came back to talk about it with his friends. He came back looking for answers. And when he did, he encountered Jesus. You see, because he had faced his doubt, because he didn't hide it, he didn't run for it, he is able to utter the words that none of the other disciples had uttered. He was able to say with certainty, "My Lord and my God." Thomas, the doubter, was the first person to proclaim that Jesus is indeed God. And the only reason he was able to make this confession was because he had confronted that doubt. See, Thomas's story teaches us that doubt is not the enemy of faith. Apathy and inaction are the true enemy. See, we all doubt, but the real test of faith is, what do we do with our doubt? The great medieval theologian Peter Abelard said, "The beginning of wisdom is found in doubting. By doubting, we come to the question, and by seeking, we may come to the truth." See, doubt should lead us to question, for it is only in questioning that we can find an answer, right? Frederick Buechner says it this way: doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep it awake and moving. See, doubts can be a great motivator, and it can push us to ask questions, and we must ask questions if we're ever to know anything. It can push us into discussion with our sisters and our brothers. It can teach us to lean on them in times of uncertainty. Doubt can push us to draw closer to God and help us accept then that there are certain things we're never going to have the answer to. Doubt can lead us to faith if we allow it to. They go hand in hand, you see, doubt and faith, because we grow in faith as we explore our doubt. Faith doesn't come from certainty, you see. Faith comes from going back to the house, even when you say you don't believe. Jesus said to Thomas, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet come to believe." Come to believe. Faith is a journey. It's a step-by-step journey of faith. Doubt and faith and faith and doubt leads us to trust that God is there even when we don't feel it, even when we can't make rational sense of it. I read an article once by Gene Robinson, an Episcopal bishop. He was talking about the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, and he said, we tend to have this vision in our heads, probably based on the movie, of Moses lifting his staff and the sea parting, and you can see all the way to the other side. The reality, he said, is probably something more like this. The people put one foot in the water, and the waters receded a little bit. And then they put another foot in the water, and the sea rolled back a little bit further, and so on, until they got to the other side. That's what faith is, you see. Doubt working with faith, working to keep us moving towards God. We doubt, but we continue to gather. We continue to question. We continue to discuss. And when we do, you see, I think we'll find that Jesus is standing right in the middle of us, saying, "Peace be with you. I'm here. Do not be afraid. Do not doubt. Believe. Blessed are you who have not seen, yet come to believe." In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.